Hello, welcome back. All right, so this chapter is all about cell reproduction. So if you remember, all cells come from previous cells. So all cells come from pre-existing cells. So this is about cell reproduction. So with reproduction, making more of oneself, yeah? So where does that happen? It happens in all of the cells in our body, right? Cells make other cells. There's what's called asexual reproduction, and there's what's called sexual reproduction. Asexual means without sex. So it's like one cell splits and makes two daughter cells, okay? Then there's sexual reproduction. With sexual reproduction, you need two parents. Two parents making the sex cells. Then if the sex cells get together, now we're back to an individual. So this chapter is about two major processes, mitosis, which you've probably heard before, and meiosis, okay? So mitosis, really you can think of asexual reproduction. Meiosis, you can think of sexual reproduction, making the sex cells, and then the sex cells, if they get together, that's fertilization, and now we have a new individual. All right, so if we look, who are these people? Jackson 5, right? They're brothers. So it's this idea they came from the same mother and father. So there's similarities between them and there are differences between them. If you know the Jackson 5, they were a musical group, right? The Jackson family is pretty musical. So it says continuity and variety. So sexual reproduction, one of the big pluses of sexual reproduction is it creates variation. Now, it doesn't mean anything for you guys right now, but when we get into evolution, you see how variation in the population is so important. All right, so learning objectives. Understand, be able to describe different types of cell division, so mitosis and meiosis. Understand, be able to explain how through mitosis, worn out cells are replaced with fresh ones. So in our body, we have asexual reproduction. It's like, how do you make more hair through asexual reproduction? How do you make more skin through asexual reproduction? So in all of our body, okay, our cells replicate themselves through mitosis, asexual reproduction. The one exception is in our sex cells. Our sex cells, we're talking about the gonads. So we're talking about the ovaries and the testes. Then meiosis happens there, okay? So understand and be able to explain how sperm and eggs are generated through meiosis, okay? So we have the chromosome number. Describe the sex differences in chromosomes. So what makes male, what makes female? And we're not talking about gender, we're talking about sex. So what makes an individual make ovaries? What makes an individual make testes? It has to do with the chromosomes, okay? Discuss the consequences of deviations from normal chromosome number. What if the chromosomes don't divide right? What happens? Does the embryo survive or not? Okay. So this is, a pretty fun chapter. Okay. We're talking about sex. And as one person said to me once, like, Miss Collins, how could you make sex boring? I know, I can't believe I'm saying that. To me, it's not boring. It's just complicated in regards to how the sex cells are made. And it's super duper neat because you can think of a family, you can think of a couple having 5 kids and they're not identical. So how are they similar? How are they different? And meiosis explains it. So even though meiosis can be tough to understand, when you understand it, it's kind of really neat because you're like, that is the source of the variation. All right, so let's continue. Beautiful picture, and I will have videos for you guys so you guys can see cells undergoing mitosis and the process of mitosis. So it says there are different types of cell divisions. Here is a cell, and if you look, it's dividing, making 2 cells, yes? Yes, the author loves putting in, what if things go wrong, what happens. It says immortal cells can spell trouble, cell division, sickness, and health. Cancer is an issue with cell division. Cancer is uncontrollable cell growth. The cells just keep dividing and dividing and dividing. They don't know when to stop. So we'll talk about that in this chapter too. So most cells have their chromosomes. And every time the cell divides, the chromosomes have to replicate, okay? And every time that happens, there are these little ends of the chromosomes. They're called telomeres. Telomeres, a section of non-coding repetitive DNA that serves as a protective cap at each end. And every time the DNA replicates, that little section gets smaller and smaller. And eventually, the cell doesn't replicate again, and that spells cell death. So it's almost like a little clock, okay? Like a molecular clock, like an aging clock, which limits how often or how many times the cell can reproduce. Sometimes things can go wrong. For example, if you look at this person, he's a child, but look at him. He looks like an old man. He has a genetic disorder where he's getting old fast, okay? So there's a problem there. We can rebuild our telomeres. Exercise and proper diet can actually make it better. Yeah, telomere rebuilding, we can have that. All right, so some chromosomes are circular, other are linear. So here is a prokaryotic cell. Here's the chromosome, it's circular. Here's a eukaryotic cell. It's, you can see that it's linear. Here are cells. How do bacteria reproduce? Bacteria reproduce asexually, okay? So it's called binary fission. So it's like mitosis. So here's a bacterium, and imagine it just has one DNA. Well, if the bacterium is going to split and make two, the DNA at some point must replicate, yeah? So the two have the same amount of DNA. So if you look, it says replication, an exact copy of the cell's DNA, and then the cell splits, and then you have two new cells. So this is like the parent cell. These are the daughter cells. They're identical to each other. They're identical to the parent. So bacteria, single-celled organisms, undergo this type of cellular reproduction. So in most bacteria archaea, the genetic information is carried in a single circular chromosome, strand of DNA that's attached at one site. Eukaryotes have much more. Like for us, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. So we actually have 46 chromosomes, 46 DNA molecules. Bacteria divide by a type of asexual reproduction, right? No sex. It was just one parent cell dividing and making two cells. So it says asexual reproduction, called binary fission. First, the circular chromosome duplicates itself, then the parent cell splits into two genetically identical daughter cells. So these two cells are identical to each other and identical to the parent, okay? So this is a single cell, right? An organism made of a single cell dividing and making two daughter cells. Well, how about us? We're multicellular, so what happens? It says there's a time for everything in the eukaryotic cell cycle. So in our body, we have two types of cells. There are the somatic cells. Those are all the cells in our body except for the sex cells. So our reproductive cells are our sex cells. All right. So our cells, and think of your cheek cells, your bone cells, your blood cells, your heart cells, your liver cells. Every cell has a cell cycle, okay? So here, this is going to be important, and we're going to do this in lab, so we will reinforce this idea in lab. So the cell cycle, so pay attention to this. Here's the parent cell, and so how do you make more skin cells? If you break a bone, how does the bone repair itself? If you cut your skin, how does it repair itself? If you're a child and you're growing, how do you replicate your cells? Okay, so this cell cycle is happening in our body for growth, for repair. And if you look, here's it's a type of reproduction. It's really asexual reproduction. So here's the parent cell. At one point, so there's the G1, it's called G1 or the gap, primary growth. Then there's the S. Think of S for synthesis, DNA synthesis. So if we're going to have a cell that's going to divide and make two cells that are identical to each other and identical to the parent, then the DNA has to replicate. So here, in the S phase, the DNA synthesis, here's the DNA or the chromosome. It's going to replicate and you're going to have two. Okay, they're identical to each other. They're called sister chromatids. Now, people, this chapter is not that hard. The concepts aren't hard. The problem is there's a lot of vocabulary. So you have to get the vocabulary down to get this chapter. Okay, so we have the G1, the S, okay, where the chromosomes replicate. And G2, some more growth. It says second period of growth. And then there's mitosis. Okay, so what is that? Specifically, what mitosis is the division of the nucleus. And specifically, it's the separation of those sister chromatids. It's the separation of those replicated chromosomes. So half will go to one side of the cell, half will go to the other. And then you have two cells. They call them daughter cells. They're identical to each other. They're identical to the parent. So this type of cell reproduction, happens in our body for growth, for repair. Okay, so that was important, right? There are checkpoints, making sure that everything is going right. So for example, here, G1S checkpoint, is the DNA damaged? Does the cell have sufficient nutrients? Here, the G2M checkpoint, has the DNA replicated properly? Here, are the spindle fibers properly built? The things that are going to separate those identical sister chromatids. It says checkpoints, where are we, are critical points in the cell cycle at which progress is blocked until specific signals trigger continuation. So we want to make sure, since DNA is so important, DNA holds the code, we want to make sure that the code is separated properly. We want to make sure that the code is replicated, duplicated properly. And so there are checkpoints, because if they are not replicated properly, that can spell trouble, right? Oh, okay. I'm going ahead of myself. In this chapter, they talk about cancer, okay? And that would be uncontrolled cell growth. All right, so let's not go there yet, okay? So it says eukaryotic somatic cells alternate between cell division, other cell activities. Cell division has the cycle, right? There's DNA synthesis, cell cycle, okay? So the DNA, okay, has to replicate in that S phase. So here's the original DNA molecule. It gets unzipped, okay, opened up. And then now we're going to bring complementary bases to both sides of the DNA. And then we get two identical DNA molecules. And one's going to go to one daughter cell, one's going to go to the other. And if you look, these two new DNA molecules, half of the DNA belongs to the original, right, strand, and half is part of the new, like they're part of the new. And then on this side, right, if we start here, go here, go here, half of it's part of the original molecule, half is part of the new. So if you think about it, the chromosomes that you have, you got from your parents. They got it from their parents, and they got it from their parents, and their parents, and their grandparents, and great-grandparents, and so on. So it's kind of really wild to think that these molecules are being passed on like generation to generation, okay? So I will have a video to show you how DNA can make new DNA. It's very similar to transcription. If you remember, by now we've gone through transcription and we're going to do it in the lab, or we've done it in the lab. And so you have that DNA molecule, an enzyme opens it up. And if you remember with transcription, we brought complementary bases to one side of the DNA. Here with DNA replication, we'll bring complementary bases to both sides of the DNA and make two brand new DNA molecules. And they are the sister chromatids. All right, so it shows that, right? It shows the enzyme coming in and then getting the two sister chromatids. All right, we're going to stop here and then get going with the next, with mitosis.